Another unique thing about these guys is in fact that many people don't realize this, but they've done a lot of studies on them in the wild, and they've actually found that they are Hi friends, it's Collin, and in today's video we're going to be talking all about one of my favorite reptile species. This is Anolis barbatus, also known as the Cuban False Chameleon. Let's talk a little bit about their natural history. So, although the name, they're called a false chameleon, these guys are actually in the anole family. So the Cuban False Chameleon is found on the western side of the island of Cuba. These guys are a medium-sized anole. They typically attain a size of approximately 7 inches in total length. So they are large for an anole, but medium-sized overall for a pet lizard. In the wild, these guys, their lifespan is going to be a little bit shorter, but in captivity we found that most reliably these usually have a lifespan about 7 to 10 years with really good care. So the next thing we'll talk about would be housing. So for a Cuban False Chameleon, for a baby or a smaller one, what I would recommend as far as housing would be probably like a 18-18-24 Exoterra, something that's a little bit taller, on the taller side. You could use an aquarium, but it's a little bit nicer to have a front opening terrarium in the sense that you don't have to move your lights every time you get into the cage. And these guys are gonna prefer a space that's more height than necessarily width. For an adult size enclosure, if you have a shorter space to work with, for your Cuban False Chameleon, what I would recommend would be a 40 breeder or something that's like a 4x2x2. And if you have a taller space, what I'd recommend would be maybe something like a Paludarium by Zoomed where it's 36 by 18 by 36. You could definitely keep an adult in one of those very nicely, and that would give you plenty of arboreal space and coverage. Keep in mind these guys do like to kind of hide out throughout the day, so they do prefer to have that additional space where they can hide out. Now, as far as keeping multiple together, generally, we recommend that the Cuban False Chameleon is kept solitary. The only exception would be if you kept a male and a female or a group of females together. But in general, the Cuban False Chameleon, just like all anoles, is territorial. So they are best kept either by themselves, or if you can 100% guarantee the sexing, sometimes they can be kept in a group, but that's not 100% definitive. Keep in mind that even if you have a male and a female, there's a good chance that they may not even get along. So, in general, when keeping as a pet, these guys are best kept solitary. All right, so the next thing we'll talk about for our Cuban False Chameleon is substrate. So here at the Tye-Dyed Iguana, we prefer to use a tropical mix substrate, like our Advanced Substrates Tropical Mix. You could also use a mixture of Zoomed Repti soil mixed with Repti bark. That makes for a very nice mixed texture consistency product, very natural. The main thing with these guys is they do like decently high humidity, so 60 to 70% humidity is ideal. Having an additional substrate layer that has some extra sphagnum moss or some activated charcoal in there can really help as far as maintaining humidity. And as well, if you're using a product like our tropical mix that's ready to go, it's going to be perfect for having a terrarium that's going to be bioactive, which would be excellent for supporting live plant growth throughout your terrarium. So tropical mix substrate or Repti soil mixed with Repti bark, I think either one of those would be better. I'd probably go with the tropical mix just because it's got sphagnum moss and some activated charcoal mixed in already. All right, as far as heating the terrarium for your Cuban False Chameleon, we are going to recommend a basking spot on the warm side of approximately 90 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. It's very important that with these guys, of course, they can climb, they can get up really close to the top of the lid. So you're going to want to make sure you have a bulb of appropriate wattage over one side of the tank. Now, this will vary depending on the size of your enclosure. So if you're in doubt, be sure to ask an associate or double check your wattage because we want to have that exact basking temperature, 90 to 95 at the basking site. So that may not necessarily mean that it's 90 to 95 at the bottom of the enclosure, but in that 8 inches away from the screen where the basking site actually is, we want to measure that actual temperature. And then that should be 90 to 95. Always a good idea to check it with a nice quality infrared thermometer just to measure true surface temperature, not air temperature, just because those can put off some strong UVB. All right, so for ambient temperature in the enclosure away from your basking spot, we're going to generally recommend about 75 to 82 degrees for ambient air temperature during the day for the just general heat. And then for nighttime on the cool side of the enclosure, temperatures can drop anywhere from 68 to 72. So most of the time in most people's houses, you won't necessarily need a nighttime heat source unless your house gets really cold in the winter or you love your air conditioning. Now, as far as UVB is concerned, These guys will appreciate a high quality UVB source. Good options would be basically like a T5 5.0, like a tropical equivalent. That would be fantastic, especially if it runs the length of the enclosure. If you have plenty of coverage, branches, plants, things like that in there, that's gonna give them plenty of opportunity to get away from it. But keep in mind, 5.0 is not too strong, where they're, if they're right up there on the screen, hanging out on the top of the canopy, they're not gonna get being blasted with UVB. So it's just gonna be a nice, happy medium for you. If you decide to go with another source of combined heating and UVB, like a mercury vapor bulb, just make sure you're using something of appropriate wattage. In most of your taller enclosures, you'll use something like an 80-watt Power Sun or something a little bit on the smaller side. Those would be great options. But like I said, double check your temperatures, because those guys can run a little bit on the warmer side. And as well, make sure the animal can't get super duper close. One more quick thing about lighting, we want to talk about photo periods. So just like most reptiles, you want to have your white lights on for anywhere from 12 to 14 hours generally. Here at the Tye-Dyed Iguana, we like to have a 12-hour photo period, means lights are on for 12 hours, off for 12 hours. That'll help to keep natural circadian rhythms, and it prevents from disrupting your reptile's behavior. All right, so the next thing we'll talk about is humidity. So we know these guys are from broadleaf forest, kind of subtropical habitat. So in the wild, these guys will experience, of course, fluctuations in humidity, but generally in captivity, the preferred range would be somewhere in 60 to 80% range. So this can be achieved through multiple methods. You can obviously do hand spraying. You could utilize devices like a reptifogger intermittently, or you could also use something called a monsoon system, which is like an automated mister. As long as you have decent humidity, you'll be okay. One thing I will say though, and this is a common mistake people make, is they like high humidity, but like all reptiles, they also appreciate high quality ventilation. So even though they do have periods of increased humidity, it is good to have good airflow throughout the tank. That will help to inhibit any secondary mold, mildew growth, things like that, especially if you have a bioactive vivarium with lots of live plants and cleanup crew and things like that. Having good humidity but good ventilation, very important for any reptile. So let's talk about diet. So in the wild, these guys are kind of unique. So these are molluscivores, which means they eat in the wild a primarily diet of mollusks. So snails, slugs, things like that. Luckily for us in captivity, they can be transitioned onto a diet that is about, I'd say about 50-50 mollusks and insects. So they can eat roaches, crickets, different worms, things like that. But we do like to provide them that mollusk source. Very important though, you want to use something that's not from outside. So never feed them snails and slugs from outside. That's like the #1 no-no for these guys, because they can have different amoebas, protozoans, and things like that, different parasites in them. You never want to feed snails or slugs from outside. What I do recommend is you can get a product like Zoomed's Cano Snails, and that would be a great supplemental diet. In fact, these guys will readily consume that off tongs, and that can be fed approximately 2 to 3 times per week as part of a balanced diet overall. So that is going to fill in any of those nutritional gaps, since these guys are kind of a specialized feeder in nature. Just like any reptile, when you're feeding your proteins, be sure to dust with a high quality calcium supplement, and then we use multivitamin 1 time per week. So the next thing we'll talk about for these unique animals is behavior and handling. So, although Cuban False Chameleons can be very friendly, in general, they can be, at times, a little shy and skittish. So whenever you do handling, make sure you do nice, gentle handling. Don't try to overhandle them or anything like that. Generally, it should be a consensual situation. So if you can tongue feed them out to get them on your hand or anything like that, that can be a great way to introduce your pet to understanding you're not a threat. Another unique thing about these guys is, in fact, that many people don't realize this, but they've done a lot of studies on them in the wild, and they've actually found that they are very sedentary. So what does this mean for you in a captive home situation? So this means that your Cuban False Chameleon may not move around a lot. You will notice they spend a lot of time on a log or just hanging out in the enclosure in the same spot all day. So these guys usually only move for 1 of 4 reasons. So if they're scared or threatened, obviously, if they're hungry, so they're very food motivated. The other thing would be if they're trying to do a defensive posture or something like that. And then the last reason would be breeding. But in general, if your Cuban False Chameleon spends a lot of time in the enclosure in one particular spot, there's no need to panic, no need to freak out. It's a very natural behavior. You can see these have a beautiful camouflage on them. It really actually blends into naturalistically what would be the bark of some of the trees that are found in those broadleaf forests. So they're really, really good at camouflaging on vertical surfaces as well. One unique thing about these guys too is that in addition to having their little nails, these also have some basic sticky pads to their feet, kind of like a lot of the geckos. So occasionally, we've seen this before too, these guys can actually stick to glass, which is really cool. So that's another unique behavior for these guys. But keep in mind, You know, they're not going to be as usually as you know, like a couch potato, like a beardy, but these can be very easy to handle. Just keep in mind they can be a little shy, take a little time to warm up to, and when they're very young, they are prone to being skittish. So just remember, positive reinforcement, try to take each day in stride, and just be as gentle as possible in handling them. Last thing would be daily maintenance and care. So in general, these guys should be fed usually every day as a baby, and then as an adult, usually about anywhere from 4 to 5 times per week. As we talked about, the varied diet, make sure you're doing a varied diet. As far as enclosure goes, one unique quirk of these guys as well, whenever you do your spraying, keep in mind, these guys really like to drink from droplets in the cage. So make sure when you do your sprays, make sure you have a decent saturation on your leaves of any of your synthetic or real plants. Me personally, I like the real plants better because I think they help with humidity. But make sure you have a good saturation of water droplets on the leaves. That'll provide a drinking source for them as well, because they're not really keen about water bowls. So as far as misting goes, in most situations, due to their humidity requirements, you're going to end up misting at least once per day. If you use a system like a monsoon, you can obviously automate that, take a little bit of that up out of your daily schedule. Now, as far as other maintenance goes, so generally, every day you want to go through, if the water bowl's been soiled or anything like that, go ahead and change it out. I personally also just like to do a visual inspection. If I can see him, I want to check on him, make sure he's looking okay, doing fine. And then the other thing would be spot cleaning. So if you see any excessive waste buildup, feces or urates, go ahead and remove that at that time. Even if you have a bioactive cleanup crew, removing the bulk material will generally help to promote the effectiveness of your cleanup crew. But that's basically it for daily maintenance. They tend to be a little bit easier, pretty comparable to any of your tropical lizard species in general. If you have any questions about the Cuban False Chameleon or want to learn more, be sure to drop us a message online or see us in store. Have a great day.